Old tariffs are out and new tariffs are in. First article comes from the SCOTUS blog. Supreme Court strikes down tariffs. Da-da-da-da. In a majority ruling on presidential power, the Supreme Court on Friday struck down the sweeping tariffs that President Donald Trump imposed in a series of exclusive orders. By a vote of 6 to 3, the justices ruled that the tariffs exceed the powers given to the president by Congress under the 1977 law providing him the authority to regulate commerce during national emergencies created by foreign threats. The court did not weigh in, however, on whether or how the federal government should provide refunds to the importers who have paid the tariffs, estimated in 2025 to be at more than $200 billion. In his dissenting opinion, Justice Brett Kavanaugh suggested that the federal government, quote, may be required to refund billions of dollars to importers who paid the IEEPA tariffs, even though some importers may have already passed that cost on to consumers or others, unquote. Moreover, he added, quote, because EPA tariffs have helped facilitate trade deals worth trillions of dollars, including with foreign nationals from China to the United Kingdom to Japan, the court's decision could generate uncertainty regarding various trade agreements. That process, too, could be difficult, unquote, Kavanaugh warned. The law at the center of the case is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, known as EPA, which authorizes the president to use the law to deal with any unusual extraordinary threat, which has its source in whole or substantial part outside of the United States, to the national security, foreign policy, or economy of the United States. If the president declares a national emergency with respect to such threat, it, it if the president declares a national emergency with respect to such threat, unquote. A separate provision of the law provides that when there is a national emergency, the president may, quote, regulate importation or exportation, unquote, of, quote, property in which any foreign country or a national thereof has any interest, unquote. Lawsuit filed by small businesses and a group of states, all of which say that they're affected by the increased tariffs, were filed in a lower court, which agreed with the challengers that EPA did not authorize Trump's tariffs, but those rulings were put on hold, allowing the government to continue collecting the tariffs while the Supreme Court proceeds moved forward. Yeah, basically from there a bunch of political back and forths about tariffs and whatnot. Blah blah blah. Yeah, so 63 ruling the Trump tariffs, like the whole like 50%, 30%,
Mm-hmm.
across the board, ruled illegal. Um, However, something that we I didn't bring up to you, but you probably already heard, is that after this was ruled, Trump hiked the temporary global tariffs up to 15% for everybody. At first it was 10, then he jumped it up to 15%, maximizing quote maximizing authority in wake of Supreme Court blow, unquote. So something it should be noted is that the new tariffs, at first it started out as 10, and then some reports are saying up to 15. Um, I was curious about, how come he can do tariffs here but not there. So these tariffs are temporary. The highest they can go is 15, and they only last for 150 days, which means they'll expire around July. So that's interesting. So it should be noted that tariffs aren't gone; they're just here in a different way. And I'm sure Trump will find other ways to impose more tariffs, with or without the approval of the government. But that's neither here nor there. Oh yeah, so and those like 10 to 15% tariffs, those come from like Section 232, which is for national security, and Section 301, which is for unfair trade practices. Essentially, like if another country is imposing a tariff onto us that really just upsets the balance of trade, we can impose a tariff. One example I bring up a lot was like I think I heard somewhere that American milk is tariffed and taxed like 150% in Canada. So that's an example of, well, at least I would consider unfair trade practices. Uh,
Hmm.
so I mean, the tariffs are here. They're at least going to stay till July for sure, if he doesn't find any other way. So a few things with tariffs. I, I'm sure I stated this before. I don't hate tariffs. I don't even think they're a bad idea, because if they're such a bad idea, no first developed world countries wouldn't be using them. But as I just stated, Canada has a tariff on us. United Kingdom, Europe, they've got tariffs on us, and this is before all the Trump stuff for sure. They've got tariffs on us. So if they're using it, I mean, we're the superior country, but if they're using it, it's not that bad of an idea. My issue with tariffs, at least with Trump's tariffs, is that those costs will absolutely go to the consumer. So what I mean by that is, so for example, let's say I'm in China and you're in the United States, and we make uh, plates. I price my plates because I have essentially slave labor and child labor, and with shipping and all that stuff, and there's no tariffs. Shipping and all that stuff, I will charge my plates for $10, and you have to hire Americans. You have to pay them minimum wage, but shipping isn't as bad because you're already in America, so you can charge them at $11. You are more expensive. Just based on price, people will pick my product over your product, assuming that our products are the same quality, for sure. Now, Trump imposed a tariff on China, and it's 20%. Now, I can take that 20%. That now essentially makes it, I have to sell it for $12 for my plates. You get to sell it for $11. Granted, it's more expensive than what people were going to pay to begin with. However, that being said, if I want to compete with you, your $11 to my $12, I essentially have to eat at least $1. If I want to be competitive and get more than you, I have to eat those $2 to stay at my $10. Does that make sense? So if we want to boost our economy, increase jobs, increase wages, blah blah blah, tariffs aren't entirely a bad idea. I know it's not that perfect, but that's beside the point. What gets me about these tariffs is that your plate maker here, you don't exist. There is not much of a competitor. Like, I think since like the 1990s, there was the Fair Trade Act, or somewhere between like Mexico, Canada, and a couple other countries, where we essentially would say we don't have like tariffs on you all because you're our neighbors. Well, we're gonna have a fair and equal, like, trading. So then that's where you keep hearing. Now Trump mentioned this, and a couple other presidents and wannabe presidents did, is that like our jobs are going overseas. You hear this a lot. Our jobs are going overseas. Why? Because it's cheaper to pay people in Mexico. It's cheaper to pay people in China, and yeah, yes, you do have to pay for all that extra shipping, but it's still cheaper. The corporations are taking in more profit than if their factories were in America. So we don't have factories in America. That's undisputed. Factories are going overseas. It's an issue. So when Trump imposes these tariffs, there's no competition. There's no you company making plates. It's just me. So if I'm hit with a tariff, I would just send it back to the consumer because there's no one to compete with. And that's my problem with the tariffs. Is that, now granted, Trump has stated that he's going to put the tariffs on, and even if the tariffs succeeded in the court, like they said it was legal, the problem is it takes time to build factories. It takes time to train and hire workers. It takes time to create like import resources to whatever the factory is making. That's not going to happen in a year. That's not going to happen in 2 years. I think now, this was like last year or a year before. Like, this was back when like China was like it's still a threat, but China was like having being like a real threat to Taiwan, and that's where all of our chip manufacturing is. I know, I think it was Joe Biden. I could be wrong, but they implemented like like a I don't want to say bonus, money for AI company, not AI, GPU companies and CPU companies to build factories over here. It was going to take like 10 years to just get them up and running. And Trump imposed tariffs. Let's say Joe Biden did that in 2020 or 2021, and Trump imposed tariffs in 2024. That's 6 years without a competitor. No wonder prices would go up, because there's no one to compete with. So that's my issue with the tariffs right now. Now, granted, for sure, companies are coming back. I heard somewhere that like Apple, like their glass manufacturer, they're moving that to Kentucky somewhere. I don't remember where, but they're moving to Kentucky, out of China to Kentucky. So it's coming back, but that's taken time. And well, we have a couple articles later on that discuss, well, this is why it's an issue. Um, any thoughts?
Um, let's see. Policy wise, policy wise, it's like the whole. Yeah, I was never a huge fan. I don't like tariffs. I think the U.S. is a consumer-based economy. We're not a manufacturing economy. Tariffs work best when you're a manufacturing economy, because what you're trying to do is protect local, like domestic manufacturing. Europe does it because Europe is a subsidized continent that lives off the back of American success. And so they need to find a way to stop American companies from outcompeting local European companies, which is why they need to do tariffs. China's a little bit, Canada's about basically the same thing, or if they want Canadian businesses to outcompete American businesses, they need to protect Canadian businesses with tariffs by making it more expensive to buy American products. In China, they do it mostly as like a foreign adversary thing, although I don't know what specifically China's tariffs are, but like it's probably industry specific to like tech and stuff. Also, the U.S. and China have a lot of like tech specific stuff regarding each other because that's a really sensitive area. But yeah, I don't know. I don't like tariffs. I think doing them in the first place was sort of this like pipe dream of let's bring back all of American manufacturing. I think, to be honest, I liked the way I think manufacturing responds better to carrots than sticks. I think that the CHIPS Act was a really good decision where it's like, hey, instead of like trying to make it impossible for American consumers to buy foreign goods, why don't we just give Americans more opportunities to like work in the sector or give American companies more incentive to work here, right? So if you're a company like, okay, I'm going to make X, $1 million in profits if I do it in China, but I'm going to make $1.5 million in profits and subsidies if I do it in the United States, and that's even after like having to build the factories and everything. I'll just do it in the United States. Um, I think he should have gone with like a carrots approach as opposed to a sticks approach. And also, like as per you said, like super early on, like um, it's the consumer who eats this stuff. It is an import tax. It's really hard. Like if you're a business, unless you're like some crazy ultra pro American business, you're not gonna just be like, well, we'll eat the cost, no problem. Like your billionaire CEOs are gonna be like, yeah, no problem, man. I'll take a huge cut in my thing. They're like, no, we'll maybe fire a few people and just pass the cost on to the consumer, which is what seems like it's largely been happening as per the Kavanaugh dissent. Although I don't think Kavanaugh's dissent was particularly coherent because it kind of rang of like, well, reversing them it would be logistically really difficult. And it's like, yeah, but like that'd be like saying if someone robbed. To me, it feels like, well, if someone robbed a bank, can we really, like, do we really want to arrest them? That means we'd have to like track down where they spent all that money. It's like that's really not how that works. We still have to arrest them. Um, I think Gorsuch honestly had probably the most coherent opinion on the whole thing. If you're listening, go take your time to look up Gorsuch's assenting um, opinion, where he basically calls out the a few of the people on his side for basically being hypocrites when it comes to textualism, and then the other two of the dissenting people, Kavanaugh and I don't remember who the other dissenter was. It was Kavanaugh, Thomas, and Alito. He calls out Kavanaugh and Alito for basically being like he said like hypocrites when it comes to using the major questions doctrine, which he I think correctly summarizes as a kind of ridiculous statement Not that he hasn't used it before. If you're unfamiliar, the major questions doctrine is the belief that there are some political questions that are best left up to Congress and not for the Supreme Court to decide. It's sort of their way of reversing a little bit of the decision of the that one big case that happened in like 1782 that basically gave them the power to interpret the Constitution, which was originally intended for Congress, but was then taken by the Supreme Court in that decision. And this is the way of saying, hey, when it comes to really, really big, important stuff, think, you know, tariffs and whatnot, we'll still steer clear and let the legislator handle it. And he's kind of he kind of calls it out. I was like, yeah, but people only ever deploy the major questions doctrine when it's something that is advantageous for them to deploy it on. It's like, well, if Congress not handling this benefits my side, I want to employ the major questions doctrine. I don't want this being answered because it benefits me. But if you do need something answered, well, this isn't a major question. It's an important question, sure. So there's that, and then he kind of laid into Thomas for having a very crazy opinion, which I still need to read up on. I haven't read all the opinions. Um, but yeah, I don't know. This feels pretty clear cut. I'm surprised this wasn't like 7-1. I'm really surprised Kavanaugh and Alito caved on this. Especially given the dissent that I've read from Kavanaugh. But this is like from a policy lawmaking perspective, from like an economics perspective. Yeah, I think the tariffs were just bad in the first place. This feels to me sort of like the obvious correction that was coming down the pipeline, which is why we saw so much hesitation from businesses when it came to moving back to the United States. Sure, some of them have been doing stuff like Apple and whatnot, but like these are like huge corporations. America, while we do enjoy our big companies, and I don't particularly have an issue with them per se, they're like we sort of no longer have that sort of class of like mid-sized company for the reasons you mentioned earlier of resources and whatnot going overseas, but to bring them back, making it more difficult to access the American consumer and the American labor probably isn't the play, because now if you're an American consumer or laborer, you now need to pay extra for imported goods or pay the premium it costs to produce goods domestically, because Americans are some of the most expensive labor in the world because we're some of the most talented labor in the world. We deserve good compensation. I like when Americans are filthy rich. And as a product of being filthy rich, they cost a whole lot to employ. Um, yeah, I don't know. The whole tariffs thing I think was stupid from the start. I think this was pretty obviously coming down the pipeline. And I don't I would hope that he gives up and moves on to something else, because this feels very much like a losing topic, even politically and then financially. This is just super destabilizing. Like if you're a foreign nation who wants to trade or a company that wants to do business in the United States and you don't know what you might need to pay a worker who works for your company or charge for any particular product or know if there's market certainty and that people will buy your product because you don't know where it will stand in the next, what is it? You said till July. Like
Mm-hmm.
you don't know
Yeah.
what's going to happen after July. Like 6 months, that's tiny. That's a tiny time scale on the in the world of business. Like that, like uncertainty of like 4-year elections is something that companies still have to like uh, grapple with. Like a 6-month turnaround of your product going from an additional 15% up to down 15% to like restructure maybe your pay if you're a domestic company, like you're laying people off one moment and then next you're entirely understaffed, and then yeah, like it's very volatile, it's very dangerous, and I think it upsets the economy in a bad way. I don't think you should have done it in the first place, but that's how I feel.
Yeah, I don't think you should have done it in the first place, but we clearly differ on tariffs. Like, I should probably clarify. Like, again, I don't think tariffs should have came in last year. I don't think it should come in this year. I like, at least from my mind, and we can disagree and you can prove me wrong, but it's like the concept of, like you said there, Canada has to subsidize, Europe has to subsidize because they're competing with us. But it seems like the problem is we see people are struggling to find jobs. It's more unemployment that we've encountered. I think when again he's probably looking at the service. Okay, as a service level, dude owns a bunch of businesses. I live in an apartment, so he might know something more than I don't. But when you see a bunch of people who are complaining they don't have houses, they don't make enough money, there's not enough jobs to go around. I understand from the perspective of like put a tariff in. That way, companies will have to be like, okay, well, if I want to keep more of that money in my pocket, bring some, businesses here. That way, more people in America get hired, and they can keep like their costs down in a way, as opposed to paying that import tariff. My problem is it was immediate. Gets in. and puts tariffs on almost immediately. I think it was like a year ago, and that's my problem. I think now I know there's no way of him doing this because he couldn't because we have an election every 4 years, and then and then in between, like 2 years in between that, we have Congress elections, um, the midterms. Oh, sorry, excuse me. Um, I think what he could have done was be like, hey, we're going to impose tariffs. We need more people here to get our jobs. We want lower unemployment, but we're going to give you time. We'll give you 5, 8 years to start rebuilding your companies here. You there won't be any tariffs until that time hits. So that gives you time to start building factories here, start making jobs here, and that way we have less unemployment, we have more productivity. Because I think what's one of the problems, at least since the 90s, if I'm not mistaken, because our factories were importing, we as Americans started producing less when it comes to like cars and stuff like that, and we became more of like entertainment and like not entertainment. I mean
Mhm.
entertainment for sure, but like
We're much more a consumer economy than a producer
ugh,
economy in the past. Yeah.
there's something like I forgot what it was called, but it's like we sell like knowledge, information, something like that. I forgot what the word is,
Hmm.
but we become
Yeah,
that.
our two biggest our biggest exports are culture via Hollywood, finance via New York, and tech via like San Francisco. That's like the American. Those are like super ultra high level like products that requires like a lot of very narrow skills, and a very like wealthy society to like sustain it. Like yeah,
Yeah, so I tell that, but I think the problem
like
is if you think like I forgot what's it called. I forgot who said it, but it was I want you, at least in America, take the average intelligent person. How much faith do you have in them? Probably not a lot. Now, 50% of them are dumber than that. So, you know what I mean? Like, I've worked in a
oh
factory.
I
You
agree.
don't need big brains to work in a factory.
Hmm.
You just and worked physical laboring jobs. I've had physical labor jobs that require brains and some that don't. But I think the problem is when you have factories going overseas, that opportunity is lost. So again, I get the concept of a tariff. I do, especially when like you see like these are the numbers, unemployment's up, people aren't making enough money, blah blah blah. I see the instant to be like, okay, we'll put a tariff. I just don't think,
Hmm.
but because there's nothing to compete here, you know what I mean? So the consumers are eating it, and because the consumers are eating it, they have to pay more, which means the amount of money they have is less. It's almost like a cycle.
Hmm.
So while I don't mind it, but this whole rip the band-aid off kind of thing probably was I don't think was the best approach for it at all.
I would agree. To me, tariffs kind of feel like so when it comes to jobs like moving overseas, there's a level of like this is almost like the piracy fallacy,
Mm-hmm.
um, which is sort of the idea that like someone who's going to pirate a thing probably has a lower price range of what they're willing to pay. Um, so
Mm-hmm.
like you see this come up a lot with discussions around like video game piracy and whatnot, where it's like let's say you have like an $80 game and it sees like in Brazil, like in the US, let's say it sees like a less than 5% piracy rate. We'll call that like industry standard. Yeah, we expect about 5% of the copies, less than 5% of the copies of the game to get pirated because we know that the American consumer is pretty rich and they'll afford it. And then, or we estimate there's about less than 5% of all the copies that exist were pirated. And then you look at, somewhere like Brazil and you say, okay, well, hold on now, 30% are being pirated. Whoa, hey, we have a problem here. We need to really crack down on piracy and make them buy the game. It's like, dude, none of the people there who pirated that game, or even domestically, were ever going to buy it at $80. There's no amount of
Yeah.
security lockdown you can put on to meaningfully change that number. What you're actually seeing is just a different sector of the market. So when it comes to bringing jobs back to the United States, I feel like it's very similar where it's like someone who's employing a company that is currently employing like 6 children in Indonesia is not going to suddenly go, well, yeah, I'll start employing 6 college educated adults from America who cost me literal orders of magnitude more to employ. No, they want to pay these people cent like pennies on the dollar. Like, oh, they make 32 cents because the American dollar is stronger, so you can spend less on that particular avenue of labor. And then, this little kid making like Shein is gonna like it costs you like maybe $100 a year to employ him, whereas it might cost you like 40,000 or more to employ an American. You're just not in the same market. And then
Mm-hmm.
because the way when that happens, these companies restructure themselves to allocate that excess money elsewhere. So the money that would have gone to paying an American, that additional, let's say like you have a factory of 100 people, it costs you, $1,000 to employ all those children, whereas it might cost you, what would that be, $4 million for, is that 400K or is that $4 million? Yeah, it's $4 million to employ a factory of Americans. Well, that $4 million might be put towards shipping, towards product design, towards resources, towards CEO pay, right? That might go to
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
that's already been redistributed. The business has already been restructured around the cost of labor being super low. So trying to be like, well, you need to come back to America. It's like, listen, we could and we would die as a company. We would die. Like this is not a we have 4 million in cash just sitting around floating doing nothing. We are no longer in the employ Americans market. That's not what our business does anymore. Like we're effectively game pirators now. We are no longer in the pay $80 for that game market. We can't afford that. We've restructured so much. We've changed how our business works so much that to overhaul our business would effectively destroy us, right? We can't keep up our current logistics services and keep price at, X level if we then hire Americans because now the shipping will take you 4 weeks and Americans won't tolerate that. We'll go out of business, right? Like we literally cannot sustain the employment of Americans unless it's subsidized, which is the sort of the carrot, which maybe isn't the best solution, but I think it might be more effective if you're depending on what your goals are. If your goals are to destroy unethical businesses, well then yeah, tariffs might actually be a pretty efficient tool of that. But because if you consider that like employing foreign children is a bad thing, then you can use it as a stick to punish them if they want to engage in the ultra lucrative American market, or you can subsidize them and go, hey, come back to the United States. We'll give you extra money. We'll offset that additional $4 million that it would cost you to employ Americans. So that way you can keep your logistics network and whatnot up and running until either you figure it out or maybe the subsidies stick around forever, which is probably what would end up happening. But when it comes to like, and you mentioned earlier, so here, whenever I think about like unemployment and housing and all this other stuff, to me, in my head, there's always like, this feels like this like perfect silver bullet solution, which is construction jobs. That feels like the perfect solution to, hey, we have a large population of people who are struggling to find work, who are around or below the standard, like the central deviation of IQ, right? They're 115 to like 85 IQ people. They can probably work white collar, but there's only so many white collar jobs that exist if you're like above a central standard deviation, right? Because the more like businesses are shaped like pyramids by and large. You need lots of kind of not very highly trained people, and then theoretically you have a bunch of highly trained people at the top. Not exactly how it works out, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
If it's like we need more houses, okay, all right. People, there isn't housing. There isn't like affordable housing. Okay, so if we assume that it works like a normal market, we either need to lower the demand and just slaughter millions of people. Probably not the best solution.
Probably.
Or we need to build more houses. Okay, I can get behind that. Well, how do we build more houses? Well, we need people to build those houses. Oh, so you mean like creating jobs and like
Mm-hmm.
in a world that needs jobs? Oh, who's the most likely to struggle with employment in the current setting and struggle with like that type of stuff? Well, as it turns out, mostly young guys. Hey, what are young guys uniquely suited to do? What's that? Do I hear manual labor? Someone give that guy $100. Like this feels like, and the reason I know this works, actually, the reason I firmly believe that, like, instead of like doing tariffs or doing like any sort of like this foreign policy stuff to try to bring jobs back to the United States, the silver bullet here is to create more domestic construction jobs, and we know it works because that's what Australia did. Australia was going through a very similar issue to us back in like the housing market crash and like the early 2000s when we first started to see this big deviation, and their response was to just like it was to one initially begin to subsidize some construction stuff, and then two tear down a whole bunch of red tape around zoning laws, which they had had similar issues with to the United States. They tore down a whole bunch of that stuff and created tons of construction companies that a whole bunch of young guys got into, and then they don't see the same sort of like issues that we have now with like unemployment and all this other stuff. Like they have their own unique issues because it's a different country and they're gonna have their own problems. But like when it comes to this particular sector, um, of like serious weird employment problems and housing problems and whatnot, like it just doesn't exist as much over there because they chose to like build more housing. So yeah, when you talk about stuff, it's like I get how tariffs a knee jerk reaction. It feels like um, the economic equivalent of like cutting off the wounded finger, where it's like, but it hurts so bad. I just want to just take it off. Just take it off. It's like, no, we can fix this, and it might like have some problems and like you know have some like healing pains, but like there's a solution to it. I'm done with it. I just want it gone. I just want it gone. Or it's like if you're having a disagreement with like a friend, and then your solution is to just cut them out entirely. It's like, well, hold on. Let's try to like face the problem a little bit more head on as opposed to trying to like go for the most extreme possible solution. Because that's what tariffs feel like to me. They're like, and it's not to say tariffs don't have a role. I think tariffs are actually a very useful tool when they're applied properly. I think for national defense, they're a great tool. We don't want people who are very important in our tech sector, think like Texas Instruments, who build like javelins and stuff. I
Mm-hmm.
don't want them going overseas to build these things because I don't trust those other governments to look into stuff. And if other governments are building stuff on American soil, I want my FBI and CIA and uh, DHS looking at all of that. Like this is like the prisoner's dilemma type of deal. Like if China or whomstever is building technology in the United States, I want to know everything about that technology. I want us developing countermeasures as they're researching and developing it here on our soil if they're dumb enough to do that. I would want us to do that. And in the same vein, I would look across the sea and go, I bet you they're doing that, and I don't trust them. So I'm going to look at Texas Instruments, who's trying to make money. And I'm going to go, if you build over there, we are going to charge you through the nose. It will be so cost ineffective, we will have to assume that you are effectively a spy. So I think it's very useful in that sense. I think which is sort of like a protecting American business as well as national interest type of stuff. And I think it can be employed in specific industries to be beneficial to like your average American, but it is a tax. We like to me, it feels like an important step to like figuring out how to properly use tariffs is to realize that they are a tax, and
Yeah.
as a tax, you should like conceptualize them as such, not so much as like a. Which is why I think we should just call them import taxes. I don't know why we don't call them like import taxes. I mean, I know why we don't call them import taxes because it makes people not think of them like a tax. But yeah,
Yeah, they don't like them as
I don't know.
much.
That's my opinion on tariffs.
Yeah, I get that. I think like you
That's
brought
how I
up,
feel.
I
That's how
think
I
like a
think.
like a combination of what you said earlier was the what was it, the Chip Act, where like it's like we
Yeah.
would subsidize the making of the
Mm.
chip. Maybe now, granted, I don't work in government. I'm sure it's more complicated than this, but we could be like, okay, look, we're
You
gonna
would be
have
appalled.
tariffs. We're gonna have tariff, huh?
You would be appalled.
Oh, I thought you said I'd be
I
bald. I'm
think it's
like,
more
I'm
complicated
already
than
bald.
this.
But not
No, no,
granted.
no. It's got to be more complicated than this. Well, bad news. The
So
world is
I
run by idiots who are no smarter than you.
fair, but I think something you could have done. Granted, maybe more complicated, maybe not. Was be like, hey, we're gonna have tariffs in about 5 years. However, if you not specifically like chip manufacturers, but like automotive stuff like that, like you bring your business here, we'll subsidize the building of your business. Maybe instead of like 6% tax or whatever for you need wood, your workers, well people the construction people to build it will subsidize in some way. Maybe you won't have to pay as much in taxes, so much other. That way, A, it brings them an incentive to come over here. And then B, it's not like, as you said earlier, it would cost more to just rework our entire system to do over here. It gives them time to do it, gives them incentives, and probably helps them out. And then not only that, because you said earlier, we need construction people, we need young men who can work hard labor jobs, all of a sudden, bam, they get hired. Once they're hired, then you can have people who are hired and trained to work for whatever factory, so on and so forth. Sounds like a good idea. Might be more complex in nature. I don't know, but again, I don't mind tariffs. I just don't mind. I just don't want them as a retaliatory thing. Like as you said earlier, I don't want to chop the finger off if I can sew the wound shut. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But that's not what Congress is about. Congress is about is big, bold, now.
Yeah,
And
baby.
and as you said earlier, segue, um, the